All right, good morning again. You can open up to Hebrews chapter 11. That's where we'll be. You know, last Sunday, I was able to start this chapter, and we talked about what is the substance of your faith. And I got through second service, and I had to jet real quick because my son was playing, my 8-year-old son, he won his flag football championship. I know. Don't get too excited. The story turns south. But he won for like the Venice area, right? So his team was really good. And then apparently there's like a national championship up in IMG. We just thought it was relatively close. Anyways, my wife called and she said, "Hey, you can come up here because he plays at He plays at 1 o'clock. And then if he wins, as long as they win, they keep on playing. So 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and so." How much faith do I have in my kid? Is it worth leaving here at 12:40? And it's about an hour's drive up there, so there's virtually no chance I'll make any of that 1 o'clock game. Do I drive up there in faith that he'll make the 2 o'clock game? And so you got to try because it's your kid. And so, but we made it up there, and I caught the last 2 plays of that game, and then I packed up and helped the family leave because they lost. But we got good barbecue afterwards. But it showed me like this is my faith in my kids. We talked about the substance of your faith. Turns out the team from South Carolina had more substance than the team of 8-year-old football players. I mean, who knows? But the substance of your faith matters. And then we're having this conversation last night with my kids, and apparently. Somebody did the math and figured out, there's only 146 days till Christmas. Did you know? I know, you already knew that, though. So here's the thing, is that I thought, well, isn't that just telling? We look so forward to Christmas, and turns out that is the substance of our faith. Christmas and Easter, like whatever else the substance of our faith is, it is the fact that Jesus didn't stay in heaven cheering us on from a distance. He shows up to where we're at. He comes down to where we are. And then he lives the perfect life and then dies the death that we should have died. And on Easter, he rises again. Christmas and Easter, that's the substance of our faith. That's where we live. That's something you can put everything on. Because these aren't, again, it's not legend and mythology. We don't believe in belief. That's not what faith is. There is a substance to this. If you look in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, to make sure we're all on the same page, he says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." The word assurance is substance, the substance of our faith. I never want you to think that this Christian life we're living, this relationship with God, I never want you to think that this is just the mythology that we chose. Everybody else has their way. This just happens to be our way. The way that God has called us to is based in historical reality. There really was a Christmas in a Bethlehem with a Jesus in a manger. There really was a Jesus on the cross. So as we move forward, there is substance to this. Now, faith has always been something that's difficult to define. And so it's like trying to tell somebody what grace is. It's a lot easier to tell it through the stories of people who have lived lives of faith. And you see it and you're like, that's faith right there, man. I can see that. And that's what we get to see today. We're going to talk about Abraham. So if you look at verse 8, is where we're going to start off. And we're going to bounce between Hebrews 11 and then Genesis chapter 12, so you can kind of see the source material for a lot of this. So if you want to have a finger there or a bookmark somewhere. But the first thing we're going to see that Abraham is called to do in verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going." This is the first step of faith. Abraham is about to step into a following of God that is beyond his ability to understand, which is where all of us go. So even as we try to process this morning, as we try to put together in our minds and in our hearts, what does this mean for me? let's go to God and ask him to intervene. So, Father, I pray that in this moment, as we talk about faith, we're talking about a faith in you. This isn't the faith that we've chosen. It's the faith that you have called us to because of who you are. So I pray that we would have hope this morning. I pray that there would be the joy and the laughter of the absurdity of God's call on our life, yet your faithfulness to come through for us. God, we trust you. And I'm confident that you will meet us here in this moment where we are to draw us closer to you. Give us faith. The faith to have faith comes from you, and we need it this morning. Amen. So I know the reason why I ended up in Florida, we moved down here when I was 4 years old. We moved down here from Ohio. Anybody else from Ohio? What? There's so many Ohio people in Venice. I won't get into why, but if you lived in Ohio, there's a reason why you're here. So I love it. Don't get me wrong. But my dad moved down here when my fourth birthday was spent in a Ryder truck going from Winchester, Ohio to Northport, actually, is where we moved down initially. And farming was difficult in the late 70s, and he had been a farmer his whole life. And Adams County, Ohio is not a place that you leave. It's a place that you stay. Generations spend their lives in these small towns to the point where it was such a small community. It was a one-stoplight town that turned into a one-stop sign town because there wasn't enough traffic to demand a light. So it was that kind of town. And he went from farming and farming, talk about a life of faith. I mean, if the rain doesn't come, if the wrong fungus shows up, if the wrong set of bugs show up, your whole effort is shot. You can do literally everything right, but you're living this life of faith that says, God, you have to come through. It's beautiful, actually. But when it goes south pretty quick. So he took his hand at real estate, and it was going really, really well. And then 3 deals dropped within a month, like these life-changing deals. So he said, you know what? We got to do something else. And him and my mom prayed about it a ton. They said, we need to have a new start. So God, where are you calling us to? And he was looking at Texas. He was looking at Florida, took a trip down here with his brother, and they landed on this area because it looked like there was opportunity, but you don't really know till you leave. So there was this really dangerous move. I mean, he had 3 kids. I was 4, my brother was 7, the other brother was 10. So 3 young kids, and we're just going to leave. And a lot of you have had to do this. You've had to say, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I got to take the step. This is where we're headed. And that step of faith, that first step is the hardest because you're leaving what you know for sure, even if it's troubled, even if it's difficult. You're leaving what you know for sure for what you don't know. And that's a really difficult step. So my dad comes down here and bounces around trying to find opportunity. And there was definitely more opportunity down here, but it took a while to take a foothold. And then, sure enough, I mean, he's a hard worker and a really smart guy, so things took off. But, for a while, I was wearing fourth-hand socks and underwear, like I'm the 3rd brother, and my oldest brother got it from one of my parents' friends, and so it was like by the time it got to me, it was virtually nothing. But, anyways. So the hard thing about faith is that it requires you to take the first step. And God never shows you, I don't want to say never, I don't want to put God in a never category. Rarely does God show you the whole path. Rarely does he show you what's going to happen on step 100. The problem is, I don't want to take step 1 unless I know how 98 is going to turn out. And so if I don't know how 98, let alone like 2, and God's like, I'm going to show you 1. You take this one. And this has happened in my life. I mean, Sarah and I, the number of times that we thought we were going to live in Texas for a while, and that didn't turn out. I had a different job before this one. I thought that was going to turn out. And each time there's been these drastic shifts, it's been, I don't want to do that until I know how this is going to turn out. And God's like, that's not how this works. You take a step, and then you just stay there until I tell you to go again. Like, but what am I supposed to do here? Like, it's okay to go ahead and make plans. That's not a bad thing. But like it says in James, you hold those plans with an open hand, all right? And for Abraham, this plan starts really, really early. If you can flip back to Genesis 12, you can check and see how this plays out for him, because it's pretty strange the context in which he gets called out. It says, now the Lord said to Abram, by the way, not Abraham yet, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is what's called the Abrahamic Covenant. This is the moment when God steps in and says, you, Abraham, are going to establish a group that will be my people. This is eventually going to be Israel. Abraham, at this point, when he's called to leave his kindred, his father's house, take your wife and go, he's 75. 75 years old. I don't know how old you are, but however old you are, it's not too late. Next week, we're going to talk about Moses. He was 80 when his whole thing started with the Exodus. So however old you are that you think, you might listen, you can retire from your job. You just don't get to retire from the work God has for you. And so the story we know of Abraham starts at 75. And then God says, I'm going to turn you into a great nation. The word Abram means exalted father, which has to be a difficult name for a guy who has no kid. And that's a struggle. That's had to have been a struggle for him and Sarai at the time. And starting at age 75, this is when he starts to move forward with this. It says let me reread, you don't have to flip back there, but let me reread that verse out of Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. When my dad left Ohio, he knew where he was going. Like Florida was the destination. There was a plan. God called Abram out and he's like, so where are we headed? I'll let you know when you get there. Just start walking. Okay. And he was leaving a good place. He was leaving a place called Ur of the Chaldees. Now, this is for the time, the most technologically advanced place there was. They worshiped a moon god there. And so we don't know Abram's story, but chances are, if his dad didn't, he knew a lot of people who worship the moon god. The moon shines really, really bright in the Middle East, and at night it looks like it's in charge. So people would worship the moon god. But they had a lot of technology. They had indoor plumbing. They had indoor plumbing back then, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and he's leaving that to live in a tent. And for the rest of his life, he's going to live in a tent. He doesn't know that yet, but he had a lot of money. He had a lot of influence at this point, and to leave that for a place he doesn't know because God calls him to, this is the step of faith. Everything that follows is going to follow from this initial step. This is where it begins. And the same is true of you. Whatever the big vision is for what God has called you to, you don't get any of that before step one. But that step one is so scary because it's not even because the step is that hard. It's what you're leaving behind on the zero, Like the step one requires you to leave the foundation you were on. Like, I don't know where this is going to go, but I know what's here. And that's the tough part. So if you're still in Genesis, verse 5 of chapter 12, he says, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, all those possessions they had gathered. Faith involves everyone. He took everybody with him. So his wife had to be in on it. She could have stayed if she wanted to press against it, but if you're not married yet, find somebody who can go with you on this journey. And if you're married, then find a journey you can go on together, because this is the most beautiful thing to have. It's a scary thing to go alone, but if you have somebody you can go with, it's beautiful. And by the way, we have each other that we can go with. So regardless of your status, we have each other to go on this journey with. And that's how God designed the church. And this is where it begins. So back in Hebrews 11, verse 9, and we're going to be going back and forth. Hebrews 11, verse 9, he actually says, by faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. So this is where we get the term promised land. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. It was a foreign land. He was leaving what he knew to live in tents. And by the way, this is how it's going to feel whenever you step out in faith. Faith leads us into the unknown, but it leads us into God's faithfulness. That's the thing. When our faith meets God's faithfulness, our faith grows, and faith always takes us into the unknown. If it's known, then it doesn't require faith, right? I mean, to go into a place where you don't know how it's going to turn out, but you're trusting that God shows up, it's a scary and beautiful place to be. I always tell people when I'm doing premarital counseling, when I'm talking to these moms and dads before they have kids, like, there's only so much you can do to prepare for that, right? I mean, go ahead and read all the books and be prepped as you can, but honestly, like, when you bring that child home and you're like, seriously though, what am I supposed to do? And like, how do I wash this? Am I going to break it? And you won't. They're very durable, but they're durable enough. And so you can just wipe and all the goo comes off. It's fantastic. Kids are sticky. That's my thing. So at this point, this is kind of where we all go. I mean, that point, you get as prepared as you can, and then you start going and you say, and I'm convinced, and I've just had this conversation more times than I want to count, most adult decisions, and I feel like this should change. I turn 42 next week, and I feel like this should change, but I get the feeling this is going to be the rest of life. I feel like all those big adult decisions, there should be more information to go off of. But every time you're like, is this all I have? I have to make a decision based on this. I feel like I have about 10% of what I need, and yet I have to make the decision because by 3 o'clock, this decision has to be made. You know, are you going to buy this house? Are you going to have the kid? Are you going to get married? Or are you going to take that job? Are you going to leave that job? Like, whatever the something is, you think, this is huge. Like, my whole life, this is a fork in the road. And I need more decisions. So you ask for wisdom, and it's great. Like, ask for wisdom, pray about it a ton, and then God puts you in those moments to be able to say, do you trust me? I mean, take the path that God's leading you down. You're like, I don't know I'm not sure if this is right. But what I've found in my life is that consistently, if God doesn't want you to go that route, he'll shut the door. If you're sincerely pursuing his will and you think, I think this is the right way to go, God's like, it's not the right way. Let me shut that door. Wait, but that means this is the right way, and I don't really want this way. I know, but I want it, and you'll eventually want it when you realize it's best for you. Like, all right, let's do it. And this is the perspective we need going into those moments. Hebrews 11, verse 10. For Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Listen, if the substance of our faith is Christmas and Easter, the fact that God showed up and he died and rose again for us, if that's the substance of our faith, then what gets us through is because the reality of those means there's a reality on the other side of life. There's a reality on the other side of this life. There is a heaven waiting for us on the other side of this life, who's a place whose designer and builder is God. The city that has foundations. The one that God has, when Jesus says, I'm preparing a place for you, that's a real thing. That's an actual reality that we get to live in. And whatever hell it feels like you're going through now, that awaits us on the other side. And that's what Abraham knew. He's like, man, if I have to live in tents for a while, I don't know what's on the other side, but I know it's better. And I'm waiting for the city whose foundation, whose designer, whose builder is God. And so he steps out. And we're spending a lot of time on step one because, again, that's the most important step. And that's, if you haven't taken that step yet and you feel like God's been calling you to something, this might be that call. And if you have, I want to reassure you that God still has you. Because as Abram goes forward, he doesn't get it right. Like, he gets a lot wrong. So be encouraged, because so will you. So do I. When he comes to Canaan, he has no kids yet, and God's told him he's going to be a great nation. Shortly after that, like right after God calls him, he has the faith to step out. He shows up in Egypt, and I don't know how physically things work with aging process for ancient Middle Eastern people, but however it worked, his 75-year-old wife was attractive enough that he was genuinely concerned that Pharaoh was going to take her as part of his harem. And he said, for a guy who stepped out in faith that God was going to make a great nation out of him with this woman, when he shows up to Egypt and then says, hey, will you tell him that we're brother and sister? Because if he thinks that I'm your husband, he's going to kill me to get you. And so it would just be a lot easier if you would just lie for me. It'd be a lot easier for me if you would lie. Now, Pharaoh, it plays out. Like, he does take Sarai to be part of his harem. And then God curses like Pharaoh's whole household with plagues. And Pharaoh comes to Abraham. He's like, why didn't you tell me that was your wife? He's like, well, I thought you would kill me. He's like, I never would have taken her if it would have been your wife. You ever been in that moment where it feels really convicting because the like objective pagan in your life is rebuking you for your moral flaws? That's where the father of faith is. So be encouraged. He repents. He's like, I shouldn't have done that. That's a good point. So he takes Sarah back. And by the way, Sarah had some agency in this. I don't know how much she was allowed to have said, I'm not doing that, but she could have. And they were in on this together. They both fall on their face more than a few times. The beautiful thing is God doesn't quit on them. In chapter 15 of Genesis, God, and I do want you to see this, chapter 15 of Genesis, God is about to, it says, he's going to reward Abram. God's covenant with Abram. This is where he's going to lay it out. And this is important to see because he promised it in the first 3 verses of chapter 12. Abram messes up. And God said, here's how this is going to work. First few verses of chapter 15, God says, verse 1, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram says, which is a completely honest response, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue to be childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. He says, this is great. I totally trust you. I just don't know how this is going to work since I don't have a kid. You say I'm going to be a great nation. I'm very old. I have no heir. And I guess it's going to be through Eliezer, which is cool. You can do that, but it doesn't feel like what you said. And here's what God says. He doesn't rebuke him for questioning, which I think is so important. It's okay in the middle of these moments where you've stepped out in faith and you're like, this doesn't seem to be going like I expected. And God says, listen, this is my job to work out for you. You just take the steps. I'm going to work this stuff out. And so he says, verse 4, behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir, for your very own son shall be your heir. Now listen to what he does. Verse 5, he brought him outside and said, look towards the heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And how do you believe that? I mean, you know God's telling you, but also that's just not possible. It's just not. And faith is verse 6. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. It wasn't because Abraham had lived a completely righteous life that made him righteous. It's that he believed on the Lord. This is our story. This is what Galatians is built on. This is what a good portion of Romans is built on. Paul trying to tell these Jewish people, it was never about the law. Even Abraham was justified by his faith. Faith alone is what justifies. God does all the work. And to make it clear, and I won't read you through all this, but here's what's going to happen. God puts Abram to sleep at this point. And he says, he gives him this vision. And in this vision, there's animals. And these animals are sliced in half. And so half the animal here, half the animal here. And there's a row of these. And Abram sees a torch and a kettle of smoke walk through these, symbolizing the presence of God. Walk in between these broken parts. And you're thinking, that's a really weird thing to do. This is how you would make a covenant back then. Instead of simply signing a contract that was bound by law, if I made an agreement with you and we said this is what's going to happen and we agree to these terms, then if it's a serious enough deal, then we chop up a few animals, and you and I start over here, and we walk in between, holding hands, the sliced animals, saying, if you break this deal, I will turn you into a sliced in half animal. That's how serious this covenant is. Either we keep up with our deal as we walk through this in between these animals, or you slice me in half or I slice you in half. Whether figuratively or literally, you get the severity of the moment, right? You know who God didn't bring into the covenant? He didn't bring Abraham into the covenant. He walks by himself. This is a unilateral covenant. This covenant is entirely dependent on God. It is not dependent on Abraham's behavior. He was not counted as righteous because he behaved himself all the time. He was counted as righteous because he believed that what God said was true. He is who he said he is. He will do what he said he will do. I don't have answers, but I trust that you know what you're doing. That is our life. And this is why it was counted to him as righteousness. It's why even though Abram messes up so many times, even though we mess up so many times, it was never on us. It's always been on God. Our only job is to receive the grace. Now, you can deny the grace. You have that option, but you can't do anything to earn the grace. You simply receive it. Does that make sense? This is the gospel. This is the beauty of the New Testament gospel of being saved by grace alone, through faith alone, shows up in the first book of the Bible. It's always been the case. In the Old Testament, you were never saved by law. You were always saved by grace. That's how Abraham ends up. And just be encouraged, because you know what happens in your very next chapter, in chapter 16? You have a title over chapter 16. Sarah and Hagar. Right after he witnessed just one of the most epic moments in history, that God says, I make a covenant with you and you will be my people. He says, all right, I have a way to figure out your plan, God. Here's what's going to happen. Sarah and I have talked about it, and I understand that she's way too old to have kids, but her servant girl is right in the right age. So what if she said, my wife said it was cool if I have a kid with her servant girl? There's no way this plan works out. There's no way this plan works out, but it's the only way. You ever try to figure out God's plans for him? Because his plans are clearly not possible, and so you take it into your own hands. This is what happens. So he ends up having a child with his wife's servant girl, and turns out his wife gets really upset about it. She's not cool with that, as is the way of everybody that exists. And so so they have Ishmael, is Hagar's kid, and they figure, okay, this is the way that we can handle this, and we can actually provide for God's covenant our way. And that's just not how the process goes. And then in chapter 17, God changes Abram's name. And again, he makes such a bonehead move. And God does not quit on him. God does not quit on him. The next chapter, in spite of our failures, God keeps on showing up with grace. And in fact, he shows up and says in verse 3 of chapter 17, then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. That's what that says. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Later on in that chapter, in verse 15, he's going to change Sarah's name, Sarai to Sarah. And with both of them, there's this AH that goes in that is, and I can't do it well, but that's the point, is that it's the breath of God, the breath of God. So you're no longer just Abram, exalted father, you are Abraham, the father of the multitudes. Which again, he still doesn't have a kid. So that's got to be a lot of weight to carry, to know that I'm supposed to be father of the multitudes. He goes to tea with his buddies. They're in the Middle East, and they say, Abram. He goes, actually, it's Abraham now. And they're like, all right, listen, it was weird when you were exalted father and didn't have a kid. Now you're father of the multitudes. How does this work, man? But faith is, I don't know it's going to work, but here I am. God changed my name, and I'm going with it. So this is how it's going to work a lot. And the crazy thing, you look halfway into chapter 17, Isaac's birth is promised, it says over verse 15. Isaac's birth is promised. So God says, no, I'm still in for this plan. You're going to have a kid. And Abraham laughs at it. Sarah laughs at it, like laughter out loud laughs at it. And God hears the laughter of Sarah and says, why'd you laugh? She goes, I didn't laugh, which we've all been there. When God gives you the plan and you're like, oh, that's hilarious. Oh, you're serious? Oh, okay. Okay. And it is funny. And again, the beautiful thing is God asked her, why did you laugh? But he doesn't rebuke her for it. Sometimes the plans of God are so absurd, it is laughable. And he says, don't you know, nothing is impossible for me. Nothing is impossible for me. This is what I do. We talked about it last week. I made something out of nothing. That's how all of this showed up. I spoke into being the visible from the invisible. This has always been my plan, to make something out of nothing. And the remarkable thing, you can go back to Hebrews 11 and verse 12. Hebrews 11, verse 12. This is how the writer of Hebrews describes it. Therefore, one man, and him as good as dead, which is a bold way to present the fact that he can no longer reproduce. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. He says, this guy had faith that this really was going to happen. And the writer of Hebrews is writing to a bunch of people who are the result of Abraham's faith. We are the result of Abraham's faith. Do you grow up in Sunday school? We're all of age to have sang Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had. And then you get to move all your body parts, and it's super fun, and we get to wiggle in church. And some of you are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It was a thing. The 80s was really fun. Verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things that promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. There's a sense in which Abraham received what he was promised, because the next part of this story is that they are going to have Isaac. There's another sense in which he didn't receive what was promised, because there's not tens of thousands of stars in the sky worth of children. So how does this work? He died in faith that what God promised would take place. Listen, God's timeline is different than ours. I know most of the time when I feel like I've stepped out in faith, I have a timeline on the sort of rhythm of the steps that are taken in faith, because that's how you walk. And God's rhythm is not the same. And sometimes you just stand on step 3 for like a couple years. Like, is this ever switching? Sometimes you never get past step 3. And God takes you from 4 to 100 in the next generations after you. It's not that he's not faithful. He's just working on a different timeline. And that's okay. But it does make you a stranger and an exile on earth. There comes a point where you just have to embrace the fact that I don't want to be too harsh, but we're a weird bunch, all right? This is a weird thing that we do. Like, objectively speaking, we get together every week to talk about a book that was written a few thousand years ago. And we expect a God we can't see to use this book to invade our souls, to change us, to make us more like a Christ who rose from the dead. That is a real thing, but that is a strange thing. There's a sense in which we are strangers and exiles, and if you ever feel like, I just don't feel like I fit in, there's jokes that are made that I feel like I probably shouldn't laugh at that at work. And there's people in my family that think I'm weird because I get up early on a Sunday to come here. And that's the small stuff, right? Like, that's the small stuff that makes us strange, but it's still real. I deal with it all the time working with students who are going to a high school who are on social media and how they present themselves in that setting, everything speaks to a character. Like, who are you? Why are you the way that you are? Why won't you jump on the bandwagon? This is the thing that you're supposed to support, or this is the thing that you're supposed to be against. And why do you seem to either not care or care about the opposite? Is that an option? We are strange. We are exiles. We are not of this world. And that's the design. Verse 14 of Hebrews 11, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. So what is the home? What land are you looking for? Well, what land lies ahead that you think that's what I'm about? Because, and we skipped over Lot's story, but Lot's wife looked back, and she wished she could have had what was left in Sodom. And pillar of salt. You don't get to look back. Now listen, it's okay to be nostalgic, to think that was good times, but not in the sense that I would rather be there than where God has me now. This is the moment God has you now. You are where you are called. So where are you called? What is it the thing that God has called you to do here? I remember being in, I tell this story to the students all the time. I remember going to orientation my freshman year of high school, and over at Venice High, and we were in the auditorium, and our principal comes out, his big barrel-chested dude, he reminded me of Teddy Roosevelt, Mr. Parrott comes out, and he says, students, welcome to the best 4 years of your life. And even as a 14-year-old, I was like, oh, man, I hope not. Like, I want it to be good, but I don't want to peak at 17, you know? Like, if there's, I always hope the best years of life are ahead of me. If I'm ever looking back, wishing I had the opportunity to return to that, I mean, I enjoyed high school. It was great. But if I'm 42, looking back at 1996, like, oh, if I could just get back there. We know those people. Don't throw any elbows or anything, but like we know those people, but that shouldn't be the design, right? There should be something we're looking forward to. And verse 16 speaks to that. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. You know, God has prepared for you a city. There is something coming that is greater than where we are. And I think it's interesting that even as Abraham was faithful and he was looking forward to that, there was still this self-protective move. You know, there would come another time where he would come up against a guy named Abimelech, and he has the same conversation with his wife 10 years later. He says, hey, just tell him you're my sister, that way I don't die. You would think he would learn, right? You would think, like, it's already in the Bible that you've made this mistake. Yet isn't that how we feel every time you're like, I did it again? I can't believe that. Like, I didn't just tell myself. Like, I wrote it in a journal. I told an accountability partner. I had this whole thing in small group where they prayed about it. We're like, I'm not going to do that again. Hey, I'm over it. Cool. And then you get there, you're like, hey, listen, just tell him you're my sister. That's just, I know I'm not supposed to, but I also don't want to have a whole thing with Abimelech. So, and then, sure enough, Abimelech takes her. God curses the household of Abimelech. Abimelech comes and rebukes Abraham now, who has the breath of God in him, the father of the faith, and he's like, I messed up again. And yet God doesn't quit, because that's not how God works with us. It is a unilateral covenant. And then comes the hardest test of Abraham's life. Hebrews 11:17 says, by faith, when he was tested, Abraham offered up Isaac, who had received the promise, was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Go back to Genesis 22. This is worth seeing. In Genesis 22, it tells this story, and you can see it's called The Sacrifice of Isaac, has a little title over it. And God tells Abraham to go sacrifice his only son. He has Ishmael, and he made a huge mistake with Ishmael just prior to this. His wife got upset after Isaac was born, and said, I don't want those, I don't want Hagar and Ishmael in the house anymore. Abraham kicks them out. God rescues them in the middle of the desert. The first time the angel of the Lord appears in the Bible is when he shows up to Hagar, this servant girl woman in the desert, and rescues her child, and says, I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. And God takes care of them. So whatever position you think isn't high enough for God to hear you, God is there. And even after Abraham makes that evil choice to send his child and his wife's servant girl out into the desert to die, God is still faithful and says, chapter 22, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, of whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. I don't know how you'd respond to that. But Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men and his son Isaac. He cut wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you leave a place at 75 that you've called home your entire life. I don't know how you take the only son that you've been waiting literally 100 years for, and God says, go sacrifice him. Because God said, this is going to be the source of the new nation. But he also says, go sacrifice this kid. And Abraham says, it's not my job to figure out how these two work out. My job is to be faithful. Because I know this is true because God said it was going to be. This is going to be the kid that makes the new nation. He also said to go sacrifice this kid. So let's go. Let's go saddle up the donkey. And Isaac goes, and on the way, Isaac says, hey, I see wood, I see fire. Where's the ram? And you remember what Abraham says? God will provide the ram. He says to his servants who are with him, he took the two guys to help him carry all the stuff. Once he sees the mountain in the distance, he says to his servants, the boy and I are going to go up and worship God, and we'll return. But how? He said you're going to sacrifice your kid. I don't know, but let's go. And he goes up there, and they get to the mountain. He ties up his son, which, by the way, it doesn't speak to the faith of Isaac, but the faith of a teenager to let himself be tied up. Do you think 15, because they say he's between 15 and 19 is most commentaries that I could find. Between 15 and 19. Most 15 to 19-year-old boys could probably take their 115-year-old dad. Should it be required, they can at least run faster than him. And so if he wasn't in on the plan, he didn't have to be bound, but he trusted his dad. Maybe his faith in God was enough, but his faith in his dad was enough. All right, I believe this is going to work out. And one of the scariest verse is verse 10 of chapter 22. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Gosh, the imagery of that is just awful. But it's always good when God introduces a but in the Bible. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. He could have called the place, Lord, how dare you? Why would you ask me to do that to my kid? But his faith was, I don't know how this is going to go, but this is what you called me to do, and so I'm going to go do it. The simplicity of that, don't lose the simplicity. Most of the time, what God's asking you to do is not complex. It's just really difficult. And Hebrews 11, you know how they describe it? Hebrews 11, verse 19. This is how Abraham got through it. He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. His thought was, he's going to have to raise him from the dead. I mean, he told me to sacrifice him, but he also said he's going to be the father of the nation. The only way to reconcile that is he's going to have to raise him from the dead. Because how? And there hadn't been like resurrections up to this point. We're only in Genesis 22. So he didn't have like a context for that. He wasn't speaking, he didn't know he was speaking prophecy about what was to come. He just knew the only way to reconcile the fact that he's going to be the father of the nation and I'm supposed to slaughter him is this, until the ram shows up and the voice of God says, stop. God will never accept human sacrifice other than Jesus, by the way. That's the only one. There will never be a sacrifice on behalf of God for our sins that's a human other than Jesus. I was reading through this and I thought, if there's a way to finish this message, it has to be with my own story of my wife, Sarah, and my son, Isaac. Because there was a point, and some of you were around for this, Isaac, when in 2012, he's 8 years old now, he turns 9 in a few weeks. And when he was 3 weeks old, he was born August 19th, 2012. When he was 3 weeks old, he got this fever that was just nasty. One of those fevers that, any fever at 3 weeks old is pretty bad, but you get up to 103, 104 with a 3-week-old, and it gets really scary. And it was September 11th, and the EMS people showed up with their dress stuff on because they had been at a ceremony for September 11th, and they showed up to the pediatrician, put him in the ambulance. Since our third kid, we've had kids at the hospital with fever before. We're like, all right, it'll be a day and a lot of money, but we'll get him back. And I don't mean to be flippant. It's just, your third kid, you're a lot less paranoid. Anyways, they get him there, and they're like, this Motrin doesn't seem to be taking the edge off. Give him some stronger stuff, doesn't seem to be taking the edge off. So they start putting needles in him, starting to take blood out of your kid. And here's a picture of him with his little hands all bandaged up at 3 weeks old because they couldn't figure out a way he's so tiny, right? Like, how do you get blood out of those tiny little hands? And it was so hard. We ended up being there day 1. They couldn't figure it out. Day 2, still, the fever's not breaking. Day 3, still not breaking. Day 4, they said, well, here's the thing. The good news is none of the things that we've tested for have come out positive. Like, all the things we're testing for are really bad. So if any of those are positive, that's really bad. Your best case is that none of these things come back with a positive. Okay, but then you're just left with the unknown. Day 5, still the fever will not break. Day 6, that moment when the doctor pulls Sarah and I aside and says, here's the thing. This should have broken by now. So based on what we've done, we have to take a lot more tests. So we have to get some blood. And it was all really fast because you could tell this is like a whole strategy they've got to deal with parents who don't want their kid to bleed. And they say, so we have to get some blood. We have to get 12 vials of blood. And you're like, wait, I'm sorry, 12 vials of blood? And so the nurse says, so Dad, I need you to come with me. I'm like, what? And so I go with her, and my job was to take my 3-week-old and to be the comfort. And it's a whole thing, but I'll never get out of my head the image of holding down my 9-pound kid while they poke his heels because they got to get the blood out of his heels, and they kind of milk blood out of the heel into vials of. And they're tiny vials, but still 12 of them. And there's nothing that's taught me more about being a child of God than being a parent to my kid. Because I watched my 3-week-old look at me. Like, what are you letting them do? Objectively, they're torturing him. And whatever, I'm putting a lot of thoughts into a 3-week-old, but you could just see it on his face, this look of betrayal, looking at me like, how could you let them do this to me? Worse than letting them, you're holding me down. You're not even letting me defend myself. And this next picture you can see the bandage on his heels afterwards, but it was awful. And these ladies were so nice. They were so kind about it. They were doing their job. And the thing I couldn't express to my son Isaac on that table in Sarasota Memorial was, this is me loving you. And I know there's 0%. There's just no way he could understand why this is happening to him. The only thing he could do was look at me and say, whatever, again, I'm putting thoughts in a 3-week-old, but whatever faith I have in you, I have to trust that you know what you're doing, because this is awful. This is evil, and nobody lets something like this happen to their kid. And I thought, man, that's me. That's what I do to God all the time. I say, God, how could you let this happen? This isn't okay. There is no way this moment is okay. There's not. And it would be like me explaining to 3-week-old Isaac, well, what you don't understand is they need these vials of your blood because they're testing for these 17 different diseases. And based on which one of those it is, you deserve a different treatment plan. Do you think that would have helped him if I explained it? No, it wouldn't have helped him. Even if God lays it out for you, the only hope we have is faith in a God you're like, I don't understand how this could be good. Abraham steps in and says, I don't get it. I don't know how you can do this. But I have faith that you are who you say you are, and you're going to do what you say you're going to do. So let's step. So I don't know what the moment is you're sitting in, but if you're waiting on an explanation, don't be surprised if God doesn't give it, or maybe he gives it and you're like, but that's not enough. That doesn't make this okay now that I know why. Sometimes you just have to trust that the only thing scarier than the idea that there's a God who would let that happen is that there is no God and you're just stuck in the chaos of chance. That's terrifying. God has a plan for your story. 2 days after that, we went home. He was fine. They never did figure out what it was. None of the things they tested for turned out positive, but it was just one of the scariest moments of my life. And thinking back to that, and it says in 1 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith and not by sight. It's the proverb of we trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. It's not ours to see. It's not ours to understand. It's ours to be obedient to the call. And you know what Abraham was called as a result of his faith? James chapter 2, verse 23. And scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You know what God calls himself throughout history? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not that Abraham was perfect. He just took the next step. So whatever the step is, ask for wisdom around you, read his word, pray like crazy, and trust him with that next step. God, we need you. This has never been something we can do on our own, and this is us before you surrendering our need. So meet us in this moment and show us the next step. Lead us into that place, and thank you for your faithfulness. Even when it doesn't turn out like we want, we trust you. You are our only hope. Thank you for giving us faith in a God who is faithful. Amen.